Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fueling Collaboration. Let's just get started here. My name is Andrea Brandon. I'm the Science Delivery Specialist with the Northern Research Station, and it is my absolute privilege to be introducing Fueling Collaboration today. So Fueling Collaboration is a panel discussion series presented by the Forest Service Northern Research Station, the Southern Research Station, as well as the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Networks, the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, Lake States Fire Science Consortium, the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, and the Oak, Woodlands, and Forests Fire Consortium, the Southern Fire Exchange, and the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium. That is a mouthful to say all of that. So our goal is to bring together researchers and managers together to learn about and discuss the latest in fire science and application, and to build collaborative opportunities across the region. Today is the second in our 5-part series. Last year, we covered topics on fire history, seasonality, fire and climate change, fire and timber management, all using a similar format to what you'll see today. Today's discussion is going to focus on timber management, and we have Joe Marschall as our moderator today. And Joe is going to introduce our panelists in just a few minutes. But before we do that, I would like to acknowledge our organizers for this event. This series is, as I mentioned, a collaboration among multiple agencies and organizations, and each person here has contributed a significant amount of their time and energy into making this fun, informative, and just an exciting event for you all. So we hope you enjoy it. And before we move on, I just would like to draw your attention to our future topics. So as I mentioned, this is a 5-part series. We hope you'll join us for the rest of the 2021-22 winter season as we touch base on other regionally important and cross-cutting topics, including smoke management, fire in the WUI, as well as we'll be wrapping up the season with a discussion on the benefits of prescribed burning that go beyond fuel reduction, touching base on topics of burning for tick control, blueberries, or in rare species habitat. Now, I know you're not here to listen to me, so at this point, I'm going to pass it on to Joe Marschall. Joe, the floor is yours.
Great. Hey, thanks, Andrea, very much. And hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on timber management in oak pine mixed woodlands and the use of fire. My name's Joe Marschall. I'm coordinator for the Oak Woodlands and Forest Fire Consortium. We're one of 15 fire science exchanges funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. I'm also a senior research associate at the Center for Tree Ring Science at the University of Missouri, where I'm fortunate enough to get to tag along and participate in some fire history research here in the Eastern US. First, I'd like to thank my fellow Fueling Collaboration Series collaborators. The efforts of this team has made my job pretty easy here. I'd also like to thank our panelists and their organizations for their time and support. And I also thank all of the folks attending today for guiding this discussion with your submitted questions and also through your contributions today. We're really fortunate to have basically a dream team of fire and forestry management and research experts on today's panel. If I had to make a list of experts that I'd really like to get together with and discuss this topic informally after a conference or workshop or similar event, the folks on this panel would truly be that. And so today we plan to discuss the opportunities and challenges related to prescribed fire use in mixed woods where timber management and natural community objectives coexist. And so with that, I will introduce our panel. Dr. Callie Schweitzer is a research forester with the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station's Upland Hardwood Ecology and Management Research Work Unit. She's located in Huntsville, Alabama, and much of her research relates to disturbance and silviculture practices in the mixed woods, including topics like transitioning pine plantations on the Cumberland Plateau to mixed woods and fire-induced wounding and mortality in oaks, and much more. Brian Stearns is a zone fuels specialist on the Huron-Manistee National Forests and is located in Wellsville, Michigan. He began his wildland fire career with the Forest Service in 1997. Brian is seriously probably one of the most interesting people I know, and only partially because he's incredibly rooted in both the management and research realms surrounding prescribed fire, and he has particular experience and knowledge in the mixed woods of the Great Lakes region. Dr. John Kabrick is a research forester with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station. His research relevant to this discussion focuses on silviculture and interactions between the physical environment and forest regeneration processes. He is part of a research group that recently developed a series of publications in a recent special issue in the Canadian Journal of Forest Research titled Temperate Mixed Wood Forests, Ecology and Management of Hardwood Softwood Mixtures. Heather Slayton is the Assistant State Forester for the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, Division of Forestry. She oversees the division's forest management, reforestation, and state forest units, and also the administration of the division, which includes workforce, budget and grants, data, and real property. In other words, Heather knows the practical and technical needs regarding managing and sustaining forest resources from a state level perspective. She has degrees in forestry from Virginia Tech and the University of Tennessee. And beyond her high level of administration knowledge, Heather has a decade plus experience as a consulting forester in Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And so I think she offers a perspective from the stand all the way up to the state level. And last but far from least is Dr. Ben Knapp. He's an associate professor of silviculture in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Missouri. His research interests include refining the use of prescribed burning to reach silviculture objectives, particularly related to how fire affects tree regeneration and long-term forest development in the eastern U.S. Of particular relevance to today's discussion, he has led work with a group of partners that looked at fire effects after 60 plus years of burning on the structure, composition, and timber value of upland oak forests. And so with that, I welcome our panel and thank you for your time today. And I look forward to a very lively discussion. So I'd like to place a couple of ground rules here and provide a little bit of context for today's discussion. Again, this discussion is guided by the questions that were submitted upon registration. You can see the distribution of some broad categories of those questions in the pie chart below. In general, the discussion is going to focus on the geography where oak and hard pine coexist. And for these hard pine species, I'm largely referring to pitch, red pine, shortleaf, Table Mountain, in forests of the eastern U.S. I encourage this group to be candid. I'm pretty sure you're amongst friends and that this is a friendly group. And I encourage you also to let's treat this like as much of a free-flowing conversation as we can. Please jump in, ask your own follow-up questions that I might not highlight. And all of these will make my job easy. And so I thank you in advance. Here's the general topics that I think we're going to largely stick to. We're going to talk about prescribed fire in mixed woods and charring and scarring on residual trees, forest structure, composition, and regeneration dynamics, silviculture prescriptions, and public and professional perceptions of fire in timber management of mixed woods. So we're really close to the discussion. but I'm going to provide just a few moments of historical and ecological context that I think may place a little bit of relevance on this discussion. And by the way, for the panelists, anything I'm going to say now, I welcome you to refute in your first opportunity. So I'm going to show pictures of some cool sites and cool pieces of wood from across the region in these oak pine mixed wood sites. And the first up is a picture of a red pine stump that grew from 1755 to 1905 in the northern Appalachians. During that time, it recorded at least 7 fire scars. And beyond that one stump, if we look closer, we'll see that the forest understory here is actually littered with just such remnants, many of which are actually much older, some even preceding the time of Christopher Columbus reaching America. And so beyond that, what I encourage you to look at here and in other pictures that I'm going to show is the juxtaposition and comparison of the story that this remnant wood tells us and the existing forest community today. Here, for instance, there's not another red pine in sight. However, the forest overstory is dominated by upland oak species and northern hardwood species. Similarly, here in the Central Apps, we have a pitch pine stump with fire recorded scars and along, showing a deep time. And here again, look at the forest community surrounding it. And also note that these are actual stumps. These aren't snags. And so these are stumps that have, extensive records within them. They have fire damage to those. And yet they were obviously still of high economic value in terms of, timber. Here's another site, the Ozark Highlands. Here's a shortleaf pine. And it very similar story, long-term recurrent fire and a drastic departure in terms of today's forest community. One more, here's on the Cumberland Plateau, shortleaf pine. Today, imagine how different the forest community must have looked during the time period in which this tree lived and also the times before that, which enabled this tree to be on that site. Today, it's an upland oak and heavy red maple. And here's the last one. This is maybe one of my favorite. This is a red pine in Lower Michigan. That's actually a stump in a pine plantation that was dug up during the CCC days during site prep in order to plant those trees. And the stump was dug up and placed in that row by some operator. Little did he know that someone would be so interested in it in the future and that we would find cool, informing information from it. And so from all of that, I set the stage with these next bullet points that these and other sources of information indicate that the eastern US forests were historically more mixed woods than they currently are today. They were also more complex and open. It reveals a very certain deep time association with frequent or semi-frequent fire within low severity and anthropogenic context of that fire regime. These historical fire regimes that I just talked about, they no doubt produce both the valuable timber, consider what was exploited during the timber exploitation era in the late 1800s in the US, and they also produce the desirable ecological conditions that we often talk about today. And I think importantly, it points that if we wish to maintain these systems across the eastern US in a spatial extent that is at all meaningful, that hands-off management will likely not sustain these conditions that we care for. And so that's it for my opening slides. I thank you for bearing with that. And so for now, the format is I'm going to list a question and maybe provide just a tad bit of context for that, and then loosely direct that towards someone. And from there, though, I encourage the panelists to jump in. Okay. So we hear from forest managers that char-related issues negatively impact their ability to access certain markets, including pulp markets. Some question whether this is an actual issue or if it is really a perception issue. So I tee this off with these questions about what's the actual perspective of timber industry and timber administrators. And also, I hope to jump into how long does this char persist? Is that known? And post-fire, and what kind of problems might that actually relate to? And so, Heather and Callie, I know you all did some homework that will inform this question to some extent. And so, are you able to kind of touch on this question and also some of that work that you did?
Yeah, this is Heather. I was waiting to see if Callie was going to jump off mute too. But yeah, thank you, Joe, and thanks for the invite to be a part of this panel. I'm super excited about it. But yeah, to your point, Callie and I, when you asked us to be a part of this panel, we jumped at the opportunity because I think we had some questions too that we were excited to ask industry, and maybe some misconceptions or some rumors on our part too that we were just seeing if they had some truth to them. So what we did was we got some representatives from like pulp and paper industry, tie logs, stave logs, hardwood sawmillers, pallet sawmillers, consulting foresters and procurement foresters. So the only group that we left out was landowners, but perhaps that could be a 2.0. And so we just developed some very informal questions and had a 30-minute phone call with each of them. And it was very enlightening. It was really, I actually would recommend that to every manager or every scientist out there, is to just have that relationship with your local industry, because they love to talk to you. We exceeded our 30 minutes several times. You know, they had a lot to say about it. But so, and Callie, I'll throw something out there and you can confirm or clean it up. But for the most part, you know, sorry, back up. These are Tennessee centric managers. So it was a small sample size, so to speak, regionally. But I practiced in a couple of different states and I didn't find their answers to be any majorly different from what I know in other states. But nonetheless, you know, industry is very good at managing around SCAR and defects. And, you know, they've got ways to cut out defects. They've got, you know, very high tech saws or, you know, equipment at their facilities to manage around them. So they can still make a good product out of stems that are damaged. And then, you know, a lot of them, like we talked to a pulp and paper procurement fella, and he said, you know, sometimes there's char that comes in to their mill, and as long as it's not super pervasive, the debarker usually takes care of it. But if it does get underneath that bark into the tissue, then that's a problem, because they have a hard time bleaching it out, and it creates these like black specks in the product. So that's a problem for them, but he didn't say that was, like I said, pervasive or whatnot. And by the time that it gets to the mill, you know, if they look out and see a bunk full of just crispy stems, they're just going to reject the entire you know, load. So the logger who didn't, I guess, put two and two together before he brought that load there is the one that kind of suffers there. So, you know, that's why I said that by the time it reaches the mill or the industry or the yard, a lot of times the loggers have already handled it because they know it's going to get rejected. Why would they waste time bringing it there? So yeah, Callie, do you want to jump in and anything else to that?
Yeah, so thanks, Heather. Yeah, it was extremely enlightening, and I can tell on myself, and Heather, you can decide if you want to tell on yourself or not, but we did, both of us, oh, I'm telling on you, did a 180. We had heard the forest legend was, you know, no char, no fire scars, you get less money, we don't want it. And that is not the message we got from forest industry at all. They don't necessarily care. As Heather already indicated, they have ways to handle it. If something does come in and it has some char and it's something they can't handle, they lock that off and use it in their boiler. I mean, there's just the amount of resource that's being used sustainably was incredible across all of these different people that we talked to. So that was a big take home but we got off the phone at the end of the day and we called each other and we were like, holy, you know what? Like, wow, we were wrong. We were wrong in that perception. But the other side of it is the people we talk to are not seeing a lot of the scars. So the buyers, the consultant foresters, those two in particular, they have learned that the sawmills are going to consider charred logs somewhat of a defect. And so they don't take them. So a lot of that charring is left in the field. So interesting to note, Joe, in one of your photos, how high that tree was cut off. So maybe even back whenever that was harvested, they were jump butting them even then. And so there was a little bit of a disjoint between what's happening in the field and fire and the perception of fire defect on trees and what the buyers and the mills are actually experiencing because they're not seeing those. So do you want to pick up from there, Heather, about the landowners?
Sure. Yeah, man, you and I are an excellent team on this. We were really excited about this, having this opportunity. But yeah, so I think it's the landowners that lose, right? The procurement forester we talked to, the consulting forester we talked to, they all said, if they're cruising forests and trees and they're just going through the woods, they kind of see these defects. They already know in their head that they're just going to go ahead and maybe discount what they're going to offer the landowner. Right. So in all of this, it's the industry is good. They can manage fire, they can manage scarring, they can manage char. Procurement foresters, they already kind of know what's happening. Loggers, they're scraping it off themselves or jump butting it, managing it so they don't get rejected. But it's truly the landowner that's going to be left holding the bag if there is this misconception, right? So I think that's where we have a lot of work to do as managers and researchers, is getting it out there to the landowners and bringing those two factions together and saying, hey, there's a lot of cultural lore around fire in hardwoods, particularly. They weren't really, nobody we talked to really was focusing on pine. It was more hardwood products. But it's truly the landowners that have to understand the potential risk, not only biologically, like physically, that's happening to their tree, but also cultural. There's that cultural risk too. And so they could certainly, have a lot of value left out in the woods, whether it's true or not. And, managing hardwoods, all of us have like one shot at it, and so if you're going to do one harvest in a generation, and you've let some uncontrollable fire get through there multiple times, repeated fires, you've just kind of lost your generational chance at maximizing the value out of that forest.
Any ideas of solutions for this disconnect that's leaving the landowner kind of holding the bag?
So I'll start to speak to that, and Heather, you can certainly jump in. What was really positive to hear from all of these industry and consultant foresters was they were so supportive of using fire as a tool if it's going to, if nothing else, show people that we need to actively manage. Again, back to your point, Joe, no management is probably leading us in the direction we don't want to go. So could fire be one of those tools that gets people maybe excited about doing some type of forest management? And so they all were very positive. There was one consultant who said he just didn't deal with fire much at all, but they were all very positive about sort of that being, somewhat charismatic in a very positive way of getting people excited about forest management. So that was a plus. And then we just talked ad nauseum about science delivery, outreach. I don't know. We have some experts who helped set up this. What are we not doing that we could be doing to get a hold of more of these landowners and be honest with them and talk to them about the benefits, the risks, what they're getting into if they make no decision. it's a big outreach science delivery conundrum.
Hey, so Callie and Heather, I was going to follow up and say, it seems like one of the things that would be very beneficial to landowners is working with a professional forester, like a consulting forester or someone from the state conservation department, because they would be really fundamental in helping that landowner understand the risks, the benefits, and even how to go about using a tool like prescribed fire to get the outcome that's intended, with the objectives of the landowner in mind. So if timber production is an important objective of the landowner, that professional can help that landowner apply fire in such a way that it's not going to, I guess, run counter to that objective. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, not all fire is equal, right? I mean, there's, and not all RHs are equal. So I think I absolutely agree with you, John. I'm a huge supporter of professional foresters. I mean, I wouldn't sell my house without a real estate agent because that's not my thing. So I wouldn't sell my timber without a forester. So, I mean, maybe that's just me because I was a consultant, but yeah, I think that they should engage some professionals. And, but that begs the question of, are these consulting foresters, are they also well-equipped and knowledgeable about what's good fire and what's bad fire, right? I mean, so I think that some repeated fire with fire lengths or flame lengths like 5 feet up the bowl, maybe that would be a problem. But like slow creeping fires that never really get above a foot, that might not be a problem. But are these consulting foresters, are they aware of that when they do prescribe it? There's not a lot of hardwood forest managers in Tennessee specifically that say, oh yeah, this is what we need. We need fire right there. There's certainly the pine folks that understand how to use fire, but if a timber is a primary objective, they're not prescribing fire out there. But I mean, if there's a wildlife perspective or objective, then yeah, they would.
I've heard it. We had this discussion one time at a conference in Pennsylvania, and someone said, it was similar to this, and someone said, well, the easy solution is to set minimum bids on forest tracts where there is damage, but that the damage is, let's just say, superficial and will not affect the actual product. Let's say it's going to be saw logs. And it should, they know that damage will be removed in the slabs. And that if you just set a minimum bid on the sale, that you can overcome that challenge. And then someone else who's really smart and experienced in that said, well, be that as it may, you will never get a log buyer to buy those at that minimum bid. And so, it's a challenge, I think, to just really talk to one group. I think addressing the professional foresters could go a long way, but it's a complex situation, I suppose. So that was a lot of information about the South, and I'm curious about in the Northwoods, Brian. I know you have a lot of experience on char and effects of char and the char residence time. I'm curious, what do you think? Is it a real issue in the pulp markets where in the woods you work? And also, what are there strategies that you've learned that might help alleviate that if it is real?
Yeah, it's a real issue, or at least it's talked about as an issue quite a bit on our forests. For us, having such a large land base, I think the obvious solution is there's more than enough forest for us to reserve some for the timber industry, and a lot of our burning is done for endangered species or for habitat restoration or preservation or maintenance. We also do a lot of prescribed burning for mitigation measures for fuel reduction. And so we just try to focus those efforts in the areas that make sense, like along private property lines or in areas where that endangered species habitat is already existing, trying to maintain that. And then there's usually enough area out in the forest that you know, we don't have to obviously burn everything, and as long as we go along that approach, for us it seems to work. In areas that might have smaller issues, you know, I have been looking into, especially in the conifers, how long it takes for like red pine to exfoliate the bark, mostly the cork and the cuticle, those portions of the bark off from the tree, and you know, some rates like that where the char becomes either not really noticeable or you know, the bull char gets low enough to where it's only going to be left on the stump that's there anyways, where it gets under 6 inches. Does that answer everything?
What's the time frame on that? How long do you find it takes?
Yeah, so it's a little complex, but we broke it out into 3 different severities. So there's kind of a low severity, a moderate low severity, and a moderate high severity, which was typically what we see with a lot of our springtime burning. And, you know, I could pull up, if people are interested in the metrics for those severities, I'm talking about for low it'd be under 3 feet, for moderate low it'd be 3 to 5 feet, and then 5 to 8 feet for a moderate high severity. And then we're at 13 years, the low severity stuff is pretty much non-existent. It's going to be, they only have about 30% of the trees within the burn units that had any measurable char, and most of that was under 6 inches. And then let me pull up, I have a little graph here that, because my memory is not that great, we don't want to rely on that. So moderate low, you know, at 13 years, it's got about 11% of the area that had char, 11% char cover, you know, and you got to remember that that's going to only be on half the bowl, because on the low side, by then it's usually non-existent, and that is also at about 31% of the trees within those units. And then let's see, at a moderate high, you're looking at about 24% of that area that's got, you know, of char cover in those areas. And that goes up to 3.5, 4 feet. So there again, it's based on the severity, intensities, that kind of thing.
This is information from some monitoring program that you have, right? Looking at these in different units over time.
Yeah, we looked at about 38,000 acres of prescribed burning. Most of it was, we tried to focus in on areas that had just one burn entry. I forget, we had like 3,000 trees that we took measurements from and averaged. You know, and there's little things that you tease out, like as you get close to edges of roads and openings, obviously the intensity, you get more wind, more sun. And so we see, you know, increased char in those areas. But then depending on the density of the stand, as you get further interior, a lot of times it gets hard to find char when you get out to that 13-year in the low to low moderate kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, in preparation for this, and I think our session last year, I interviewed a couple of folks from really large timber industry groups, and they said, you know, their short answer was, of course, that, well, it depends. And basically it depends on the product, and that there's certain end products from pulp that has literally zero tolerance for char, any char, and that it really, you know, in parts of like, you know, 1 to some trillion amount or something, a little char will ruin a batch. And so they have zero tolerance, and that's for high-end products relative, but that there's other products lower end, that char wouldn't, of course, make any difference, even in terms of pulp. Of course, we know for dimensional lumber and stuff. So, and they also said that in their experience, it was about 7 years was when there was kind of a cutoff point between when after fire, at which point you could expect char to not be an issue.
Yeah, I'll just add to that real quick. I mean, we were very surprised at the stave guy. You would think that stave, since they're so specialty and they obviously have a massive respect for their product. He wasn't bothered by it either. Like he was saying that, and the hardwood lumber guy, like they just mitigate around it. So I don't know. Even like the Thai fella, the Thai procurement forester, he's like, that. What do I care? As long as the scar doesn't hit the middle, we'll slab it off anyway. So I think out of all of them, and Callie, correct me if I'm wrong, out of all the folks that we interviewed, it was probably the pulp folks that might have had a little, maybe the lowest tolerance, but they feel like their debarker pretty well handles a lot of it if they need to. But yeah, that's interesting is about the product and the zero tolerance.
Yeah, Heather, Callie, and Brian, in Missouri, the only time I ever heard people talk about that was in relation to pulp, and we don't have really a pulpwood market here in Missouri, so it's not really been an issue so much here. And a lot of our loggers are used to dealing with a past history of fire, and it's often not in a prescribed sense. It's usually some sort of past wildfire that's made the center of a log hollow or something like that. Sometimes it's a problem for a logger that bought a sale when they were thinking that timber was pretty good, and they find out it's got a lot of hollow trees in it. So sometimes there's some issues there. But I had a question for you guys regarding a pulp market. And let's think about a pulp market and maybe pine. And Joe, you mentioned this magic. If we wait 7 years or so, you don't really see any of the char or stuff on the tree anymore. But what if the stand had a fire in the past and it left some sort of ring in the tree, or a couple of rings in the trees where you could see in the log cut off that it had some fire history to it, but you couldn't tell, in the last 20 years or so. How does that affect a pulpwood sale or something like that? I don't know, Brian, do you have any experience with that in Michigan? Or Callie or Heather, did you learn anything about that from talking to the mills? I guess the question is, does it have to be fire-free the entire life of the tree? Or is some past fire okay in, say, a pulpwood setting or some other market?
Yeah, I think it really is just a visual thing for the pulp folks if they're seeing that char on the outside, because there's several different folks that it has to pass through in order to actually get the raw material into the production line. But logging's not pretty, so most of the time you're not able to see clearly the butt end of the logs. They actually see some of those nuances, and since it's such a high production type of product, perhaps they're not slowing down enough to take the time. So I mean they do have inspections and tolerable percentages of defects within their particular product. But yeah, that's an interesting concept to think about, is does past occurrences impact the actual product itself? And the fellows we talked to didn't seem to really touch on that. So don't know how much more I can offer on that one.
Yeah, so I'll just, I concur. But what was interesting, we also said, well, what would happen if, you're buying from, this landowner and a big load comes in, or you go out and you're looking at stumpage and there's a lot of char. And the guy was like, we'll work with them. They're going to get less money, but we'll work with them. We'll take a look. If it's not in the wood fiber, we still have a lot of potential to use it. And they were extremely flexible and open-minded, and we'll make it work.
Yeah, I know, just to say it again, how much what experience I have says that the end product, how important it is. John, we did this study here where we looked at recovered lumber from fire damaged trees. And we had these red oaks that had varying degree of recent prescribed fire, 1 to 15 years old. And if you're going to mill those red logs into dimensional lumber, and that fire defects on the outside, a bunch of it goes to the slab pile, right? And you're left with this lumber. And then eventually, we went down to like a 3x3 cant. And the lumber itself, even in the case where we had the loggers bring the defect to the mill instead of high stumping it or something, we needed that defect for the study. And so much of that, but we also ran into stuff, in the this was done in the Ozarks, where in the 50s and 40s, there was a lot of fire, and there were a lot of defect contained within the cant, that if this tree if it was actually going to be a railroad tie, which is the great majority of the eventual products in the Missouri Ozarks, that defect actually would have impacted it as a tie. However, for dimensional lumber, it didn't impact it at all, which pretty cool stuff, I thought.
Yeah, Joe, I'll follow up on that. I think that study is outstanding, and it demonstrates a lot of really important pieces of information that we need. So Callie and Heather, you were talking about how do we educate our consulting foresters so they know a good fire from a bad fire and what the effects are. And the study Joe did and others that I think would be really beneficial that are similar would be if we could develop through some research studies estimates of what kind of loss to expect from using prescribed fire for certain species in certain situations, certain like the red oak group species versus white oaks, or if we have a mix of pine in our mixed wood systems. I think that kind of information is really beneficial, so the landowner knows that I'm going to do this prescribed birding and it might help me achieve some objectives related to wildlife habitat or biodiversity, and I may pay a 10% cost in the loss of my timber that I harvest from this stand someday in the future. And just knowing those kinds of things, I think, are really, really important. That we need to be training our professional foresters to be informed about, and they can help with landowners. So I think that's really important finding from Joe's study and others that we should be doing that address that. What's the trade-off if we do this? And the other thing is, Joe, you mentioned the cant may be lost from some of our past fire. That same cant might go into a tie, but you also someone brought up stave wood and stave logs, and as part of our SAF technical tours that we have here in Missouri, we spent some time visiting a log yard for staves that's run by International Stave. A log yard was in East Central Missouri, and the forester was explaining that they're not looking for the cant or the tie part of the tree. They're looking for that outer wood for that barrel wood, and I think that's really key too. So we can accept a lot of defect in certain parts of the tree and still have very valuable products that are produced. So we see that here in Missouri a lot.
So John, just to follow up on the whole stave thing, I'm pretty sure Heather was the guy with the stave company said, they know that managing our forest is absolutely critical in order to maintain that oak resource. They especially want white oak. And if fire is going to be one of the tools we can use to keep white oak in particular and continue to regenerate white oak and recruit white oak into more competitive positions, they were all for dealing with a little bit of this damage on. I feel like I'm saying the same things over and over, but it was amazing how, again, flexible they were. So if this tool keeps our resource sustainable, we'll deal with a little bit of fire scar here and there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I wanted to add to the education part to it. I don't know how it is in other states, but we aspire to have every one of our 535,000 landowners in Tennessee deal, partner with the consulting forester before they manage their forest, but that's definitely not the case. And so making sure that we also reach out to the loggers too, and extend this education to them as well, and help them understand, or maybe help them be able to have a visual signature, because they could also lose money if they guess wrong, if they're offering something on the stump specifically, and they don't realize that there's the fire scar's gone deeper or taller or whatnot. So I would in the Division of Forestry, that's kind of what we're trying to do in Tennessee, is we just recognize that not all landowners partner with consulting foresters, but a lot of landowners have to partner with loggers to get forest management done. So let's educate the loggers as well. Let's get out there, and I mean, anything from like, here's how do you tell the difference in your species, to like wood products, how to scale, how to, we're always trying to look to ways to raise the tide of the supporting forest industry as well. So and then getting those landowners connected with their local forest industry representatives, so they can have that conversation, and ideally before they burn. If they're like, hey, listen, I really want to manage for wildlife in the interim while I'm growing these awesome saw logs, and you are a prominent sawmill or forest industry representative in my area, can you come check me out? Tell me what you think about this before I make this decision. And again, ideally, a consulting forester would be there to kind of facilitate that conversation. But that's where county forestry associations and whatnot are super key for everybody to get on the same page and have that conversation.
Is that a venue in which you can reach loggers?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've got an exceptionally strong forestry association that kind of oversees all of our county forestry associations. So yeah, and that's actually how Callie and I were able to access these representatives so quickly. I just called on my association and said, hey, can you provide me, representatives for each of these industries? And yeah, they were able to, so yeah, I strongly recommend, if you're not tied into your forest industry in your state, to get that way. Whether you're, have a dog in that fight or not, they have such an interesting perspective, and the loggers and the forest industry make the world go around.
Yeah, so I think those of us who do applied forest management or research, we realized how important it is for the fire people to be sort of married up with the silviculturists, but there's a lot more to this picture. I mean, we also need to bring in the loggers, because I love what you're saying, Heather, because we talk to basically maybe middle, higher up managers at the industry level, but they had all experience in the field, so they had that in their back pocket, and their perspective was just a little bit different than what we expected. And it was such a positive message that needs to get out there. So yeah, so now we have to deal with the fire people and the wildlife people and the loggers and industry people and the public. So yeah, go.
Ben Knapp?
Well, yeah, I was going to add on this conversation of fire and potential defect, char issues, scars, defect on the interior. I think a lot of this, there's consideration of how we want to burn and when we want to apply fire and what the prescription is. And so we're talking about, fire can do a lot of things. And certainly, you can have issues if you get a scar on the interior that turns into damage to, the end product, if it's a tie or if it's in a different place for a stave log or for pulp. But, as managers, we have decision-making ability on when and how we use that fire. And so if we're faced with a stand that's made up of a lot of young hardwoods that are fairly small, we may not want to burn because we might not want to put a scar on that younger tree that's got thinner bark and is more easy to scar, and then carry that wound with it, for that tree's life. So we may choose not to burn at that time and allow those trees to get bigger. And I think, Joe, with the study that you did, one thing I found very interesting was you talked about a time period after fire gets introduced before that scar gets sort of outside the slabbing or to the interior to be more of an issue. So there's sort of a window if you're introducing fire into a more mature stand, where even if you scar it, it's still going to be on the outside of that tree and maybe not on the interior and causing defect for certain products. So I think that kind of information is really important when we think about what the structure of the stand is that we're working in, the age of the trees, the size of the trees, and maybe we withhold fire to avoid that long-term kind of damage, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a complex picture, and there's still a lot of unknowns in that. I hear time and time again during that study that we did when we're out in the woods, and you come across these old trees, the old oaks that are hollow, and the presumption is that those are hollow due to fire-induced injuries, which were pathways for decay agents, which over time hollowed out that tree. That's what I hear, but I'm not convinced that's true. During our study, when we milled up all these fire damaged trees, some of them had that defect in the center from their early stages of life, really early though. And some had fire on the outer part, the very late, not in the middle. We really didn't have that middle stuff, in the middle of the tree's life. But in no instance did we, in these 90 trees that we milled, did we ever witness decay moving up the bowl, as it would be required to make a hollow tree. But where we did see decay move was from top down injuries. And so damage to the tree's canopy allowed injuries with wind, typically wind and ice here. And that those injuries then were entry points for kind of gravity induced decay. So I just don't think we know everything yet. And there are certainly assumptions on all the sides. And yeah, it's really great. And so I'm going to segue here into a slightly different topic. And I'm hoping that topic will then segue back to something I really want to hit you up with, Ben. But what you just brought up is an important topic that I can't go by. And that, as a silviculturist, you and John and others here, that you focus on structure, composition, and what are the disturbances that are needed to create those desired outcomes. And of course, this is a fairly fire-friendly group, and in our attendance, largely, I imagine that to be true. And a lot of folks, really laud fire as an all-purpose elixir. Oh, any condition, yeah, run a fire through it. It'll be great. You'll get your desired outcomes. I've heard that. I'm sure you all have too. But in reality, I think that your technical backgrounds tell us that, well, it's a tool that must be applied judiciously at the right time, at the right frequency, at the intensity. These technical details matter a lot. And so I'd love to hear from you all some contrary opinions about when are times in a stand's development where fire is probably not the right tool, when you want to kind of enjoy the best of both worlds, being, natural community management, as well as keeping options open to generate income from timber. So anybody have something to say on that?
Yeah, I guess I'll go ahead and say a few things. I'm very appreciative of Ben's remarks. I think they're really spot on from a silvicultural perspective. That's kind of how I approach fire. Is really, I'm a silviculturist, so I'm thinking more about structure, composition, and timing, and things like that. And fire is just one of many tools that I might use, or may choose not to use, depending on the kinds of objectives that I have. And so I think one key time when we have to be pretty careful with fire is during the regeneration process, the recruitment process, I guess, be more specifically. And Ben Knapp is actually involved in leading some really good work on this topic, and he'll probably elaborate on this a little bit more. But early in the life of a stand of trees that you're trying to regenerate, they're pretty vulnerable to either top kill if it's oaks, Pines are a little more resistant to top kill at a smaller diameter, but they're also pretty vulnerable to creating a lot of scarring in those trees that will probably leave a hollow spot in those trees as they grow older. There's always that risk, that possibility. So Ben's work also shows that a lot of that top killing is not allowing for recruitment to take place. And so I hear from people that say, well, just the serendipity of fire will allow some trees to escape top killing, and they'll be able to recruit and be able to help regenerate that stand in the future. But we've been looking at a lot of different data sets and using a lot of different studies. And like I said, Ben's been leading a lot of this work. We don't see a lot of evidence for it. So I think that early in the life of the stand is a time when, if it's really important for you to recruit some trees, to not have fire or really be really careful with it. So I don't know, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, John, I'm certainly interested in this topic a lot and have a few different projects. I agree very much with the idea that fire is a tool in the toolbox to use for different things. And I think as a silviculturist, we're thinking about an objective and what tools we have to reach the objective. Thinking kind of broadly about a lot of ways in which people use fire or reasons to use fire. One kind of broad objective related there is structural and in a lot of ways compositional. So towards woodlands and open ecosystems that tend to have open, vertical and horizontal structure and a lot of understory diversity with herbaceous plants associated with that, with those. So that sort of natural community type. Another broad objective we often see is specific to regeneration interests. And so there's a lot of work in different parts of the East looking at how fire as a tool can benefit oak regeneration compared to more mesophytic species, maples and other things, and actually using fire specifically to give oak an advantage. And there's a lot of research and evidence that potentially can work. In some cases, we may be kind of changing that a bit to favor a different species. And here we're looking at shortleaf pine in some of these mixed systems. And shortleaf pine often is outcompeted by oak. So we may want to use fire to actually favor shortleaf pine instead of oak to give it an advantage if there's a good way to do that. And I did send Joe a graph with some results from some work we're doing right now related to this use of fire specifically to favor shortleaf. Joe, would you be able to show that? Basically, this work we've looked at some large landscape scale style burns that have mixtures of pine and oak. And we actually created pairs for about 500 pairs of trees. And the pair consisted of a shortleaf pine and an oak. And it was across a range of size classes. And so there were seedlings to saplings. They were next to each other in these pairs. So we tried to standardize things for the fire behavior and whatnot. And what we found was within this range of about 1 to 2 inch ground line diameter, the shortleaf pine was more likely to survive without top kill than the oak was. And so, we've had discussions on this, that there's maybe this kind of window in which with our regeneration, shortleaf pine may be a little bit better adapted to fire where it wouldn't be top killed, the oaks would, and then the pine would get the advantage for regeneration. And we would favor that competitively. And so this is some very new results. This data was just collected last year and we're still working with it, but it certainly supports that idea. As we see, the green line is that probability that the pine survives without top kill, and it's at a smaller size than what we see with the oaks. So this is an example. Thanks, Joe, for showing that. This is an example of a specific potential regeneration objective where we could use fire at a certain time, when our regeneration is within a certain size, to try to favor an outcome. And then along that same kind of idea of these general objectives, if we're focusing on shortleaf pine as trying to get it regenerated, or in other situations oak, we may not need to use fire again for a certain number of years or on a regular interval because we've accomplished the objective. So we could again make the decision to stop burning if that's fits the overall stand objectives, and let the trees develop from that point. And so in that kind of to the point that it's a tool, we need to set the objective first and then use the fire towards that objective. And we're seeing, that we can get different outcomes with those different things. Yeah, others have thoughts on that. I don't know if I got away from the original question a bit there, Joe.
I'm not sure either.
So, hey, Ben, I have a question about, what were the other competitors in that system with the shortleaf oak that you just talked about?
Yeah, so one thing that we see in the Ozarks here in Missouri, when we're working with our mixed stands, shortleaf pine is the pine, and then the hardwoods are mixtures of oaks, scarlet oak, northern red oak, in some places southern red oak, post oak, blackjack oak, white oak, some hickories. We'll have some hickories mixed in there. We'll have some species like could be black gum, in some cases cherry or sassafras, but we don't have we do have some red maple, but it's not a major competitor. Sugar maple is not a big competitor. And so the species composition is different than other parts of the region where people are logging in today. And in some ways, creates a maybe easier situation, certainly for oak regeneration, but it's a different suite of competitors for sure.
Yeah, and of course I sort of already knew that, but it's such a great point to make, is that those systems are already sort of xeric to begin with. You're already tending towards not having this this mesic explosion of sprouting from these fires. So every site's different. Every site's going to be different, but that's a great example of where, I always say, why are you going to use fire? Like, what's the reason for using fire? And in your systems, the data you just showed, that's a great reason to use it.
Hey, Joe, I have a response to that question too, is there's some times where fire might not be an appropriate response, and some things that I try to look at would be other stressors that are already hitting stands, such as drought or insect infestations, or what other vectors that might be causing the trees already to have some kind of stress. Some other things that we look at would be trying not to do growing season maybe on the first entry of fire, but give them a dormant burn first, and that kind of gets that rhizosphere kind of callus back up and reminds the tree, like, oh yeah, we have to maybe thicken our cork cells a little bit, and they'll respond and be more able to take a growing season fire and get usually the benefits that you look for from those kinds of things. And then also, I don't like to do burning if the canopy is too close. So like try to get maybe a thinning in before we burn. That way, yeah, just that, that closed canopy always holds in the heat, and we see a lot more crown scorch and maybe a little more impact into the cambium with some of the heat in that regard as well. So those are just some other things that we like to consider when fire isn't appropriate, until we can mitigate some of those things.
I got a question for the group too. And Callie, I kind of know a little bit more about your research than I do the others, but I mean, when we talk about having that objective and managing for a certain species cohort, I mean, how much I imagine it plays a lot in that conversation of what was there before, or what you had to start with, and what the site should have. And I know in the South, like repeated burnings kind of just piss red maple off. We don't really we have that, like we were talking about, a different suite of competitors out there. But if you have a site and it was all red maple and poplar, and you just try to burn, are you really using it effectively if based on your objective of, changing the composition of the stand?
Do you have any comments to Heather's comment there?
So, that says opening a big can of worms, obviously.
Uh-oh.
On our more productive sites where we have such a problem recruiting our oaks into these more competitive positions, we know that we need to reduce stand density and get more light down there. So that's why I said, is fire always the best tool to do that? And that's not a decision we can make sitting at home talking to our computers, right? That's a decision that takes a little bit of wood sense to make. So yeah, our contemporary forests are very different in their structure and composition than they were even 50 years ago. We've removed so much disturbance from these systems. Now we still have hurricanes and we have tornadoes and we have these natural disturbances. We're not picking at our woods like we used to. And again, I'm talking not about Bend sites so much, but more productive sites where we're really struggling to recruit those small oaks. We have parent oak trees and they are making babies, and we have young oak seedlings, but our issue is getting them into these more competitive positions. And young oak seedlings are not resistant to fire. There's nothing magical about them. Now we think they're magical because they sprout. And I like what you're saying, Brian, wake them up. Remember, you got to toughen up here and sprout. The red maples are already there for some reason. They are sprouting with a vengeance. And it's not just red maple. There are some other species as well. In our stands, it's red maple, but sweet gum. Sweet gum's not supposed to be able to sprout over and over again. It has a weak root system. It doesn't shuntle carbohydrates to its roots, but it does. It sprouts over and over again. So, it's just so dependent on your system and what you're starting with, what that past disturbance was. And we really need to just sort of keep the past in mind, but think about where we are today in our contemporary forests. What do they look like? We know that they haven't been disturbed. We know that they are too dense. So then you ask that question, what will fire buy me? And again, I'm talking in the terms of managing in particular for oak and other timber species resources. What will fire buy me? I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really good points there, Callie. And there's a lot of evidence and literature that fire can be used in some ways to promote oak. And then there's a lot of places where you see more challenges and don't see so much evidence of that. And I think something we can't ignore is, just like you said, some things are different now than in the past. And even in recent times with more, if it's invasive species or something, that are changing the understories, maybe changing the fuels, maybe changing the way fires are even burning, just kind of within our time span of doing things. And you go further back and things are even more different. So these are a lot of questions I think it would be great to have better answers for. One thing that I think we don't know near enough about is effects of fire season on some of these outcomes, and how to use fire in different seasons to maybe get a different outcome or a more desirable outcome by targeting certain species and whatnot. Some work, old work that Brose Van Leer did out of Clemson looked at more growing season burns as being effective at knocking back tulip poplar and promoting oaks and giving them some competitive edge. Does that hold true for other species and things like that? So I think there's a lot to learn with our fire science to get at some of those things for thinking about how to reach the objective that we want to reach. Or do we want to use a different tool altogether, which we certainly could for those objectives.
Yep, I agree. I think I knew fire season would come up. It comes up all the time. There's a mixed bag on fire season as well in terms of the response. And when I talk to the people who are actually putting fire on the ground, often in the South, in our hardwood or mixed wood systems, our burn windows are already really narrow. We've had years where we've only had 2 or 3 days that the stands that we want to burn, and we're talking big burns, 500 to 1,000 acres, 2 or 3 days that they're in prescription. Smoke management, people management, road management, all of those things. So I totally agree. I think we need more information on growing season burns. We already are putting a lot of energy into getting our stands to burn. Again, I'm in the deep south and it's hot and humid here pretty much year round. Today's 75 degrees out. It's December, we would have one hell of a time getting some of these stands on a stand level, big. I mean, a lot of the work that's been done has not been to scale to burn. Now we could do it. We can get the helicopters out there and get the flamethrowers out. We could get them to burn in August. I see Heather laughing. It would take a heck of a lot of resources. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. It doesn't mean that it might not be the magic pixie dust, but we struggle with the parameters of our burning windows and expanding those. And I think we do need to do, I know there are some people looking at that, are we being too cautious? Are we too risk averse? And can we expand our burn windows? But, I look at our stands in the summer and I think, whoa, yeah, I see Heather shaking her head. It'd be hard to get, again, it's place specific and it's also scale specific. If you're burning 20 acres and you have a lot of resources, it's probably more doable than if you're burning 500 to 1,000 on these landscape level burns. And you are a big government agency that's risk adverse.
Well, Callie, thanks for bringing up burn windows, because that was the first thing that came to mind when you and Ben were talking about those issues. Because the problem I see is we have limited burn windows, and it's not because we're being too conservative. Sometimes it's just the weather is just not right to allow for burning to occur. In times when you would expect it to be fine, it tends not to be. Interestingly enough, I got copied on an email yesterday that came from one of our foresters on the Mark Twain that said, hey, for once we were able to do some good fall burns this year. And it's interesting for me to think about that, because normally they smolder and don't burn very well in the fall, even though you'd expect it to be that way. But this year apparently was very good. Well, just to let you know about Missouri's weather this fall, we just set the record high temperature for December ever recorded yesterday, I think it was. And we've had several days in December, several days in November, and most of October was, 10 to 15 degrees above average. So it wasn't a typical year whatsoever. It was finally dry enough when I think people were able to do some burning like that. But burn windows, I think, really do limit the use of that tool. And we wanted to use fire for a number of research projects that we've been doing, but we don't have the windows. Sometimes we have to use some alternative tool to help achieve a similar objective. So I think that's a very important point to keep in mind.
Yeah, and John, I'll add to that too. I've got a staff of about 400 people during fire season, and we do some long range planning for our landowner assistance, is getting all of our burn plans in, ready to go, getting them mapped, understanding the resources needed. So when those very magical burn windows do show up, it's go. Like we just deploy our people, and we really make the smoke management agencies mad at us, but we are really trying to achieve those objectives. But we also have a wait list of like 2 or 3 years of folks that really want fire going through their forest, and we just say, hey, we only have roughly 25 to 30 days in a season to do this. Yeah, I'll throw all 400 people at it, but it might not get done. So, to Ben, to your point, it's like when in that regeneration successional time frame where you wanted to use fire to affect a change or to achieve your objective, but you just, you missed that window because you just couldn't even burn. So what's plan B? And John, you were kind of alluding to that too, is we've got to have that diverse tool set to say, I wanted to burn, it was the right tool to use, never got the time to do it. So now what? How do I now do change the objective now that my regeneration is 6 feet tall and is being overtopped? Now what?
Hey, you all are an incredible panel because you kept this conversation flowing, and It's taken some cool turns and I'm excited about it. I do want to keep us a little on track here, or maybe that's not the right word, but I do want to keep it flowing a little bit into some other topics. And of course, I realize we are not going to get to it all that I hoped, and that's no surprise. I've been monitoring the chat, and there were some questions that were submitted that there's a lot of interest in discussing the use of fire to mitigate interference trees and either native and also a lot of interest in non-native interference vegetation communities to meeting our objectives. So is there a role of fire in a timber management role or perspective for kind of limiting these undesirable communities that are getting in the way? So I just want to acknowledge that we're not going to get to that on this on this panel. And I think it's probably a ripe topic for a future panel such as this, and that we will consider that. But something I have on my ledger here of questions that I think is relevant across our region, and in particular from a north to south perspective, is converting pine plantations, these kind of ecological deserts that we see across forest communities. A lot of them are relics of CCC days and different ownerships. A lot of these are on public lands. Brian Stearns, you and I toured these together up in your woods in Michigan, these kind of stagnant red pine plantations. Callie, I know that there's a lot of interest in your region in terms of pine plantation conversion to mixed woods. Maybe that's more of a loblolly system, but I think that there's a lot of similarities here. And that I'm curious, I'd like to hit you first, Brian. You've been literally going into these units and, seeing what happens using different management techniques. And I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit of, what have you learned about, I guess, the opportunity to use fire or challenges using fire in these kind of highly departed systems? And you've alluded to a couple of the lessons learned so far, but curious, do you have experience that you can share that talks to what are the steps that you can take to starting to move these systems towards something of a more mixed, diverse, resilient state?
Oh yeah. So for us, most of what we have would be CCC era stuff, would be mostly red pine, Pinus resinosa. We do have some jack pine stands that are mostly, where the majority species would be jack pine. Our sites are sandy outwash plains. So, these trees, you can see that they're emaciated. So they're already kind of stunted to begin with. They're planted really close together. So in order to prevent like a lot of mortality by introducing fire into there, like I said, a good thinning before you even get started is good, and then kind of ease into it, at least with a dormant season before you start trying any growing season. Although we have like 3 or 4 units where we have only done growing season, and we didn't see a lot of additional, maybe 2 to 3% more mortality than starting with dormant season. But having some kind of edge, I feel like is kind of the entry point for those other species to kind of start mixing in with those anthropogenic stands. So if you have existing openings, or you're working off the road systems, anywhere that you can get more sun, more wind, those kinds of things, and that fire just kind of expands that, starting to allow some diversity in the herbaceous layers, and then it kind of takes off from there. So I think just using fire, you could do it, but it would just take a lot more entries, a lot more time. But just like everything, it usually comes down to a mix of management, you know, kind of techniques and based on whatever the objectives are for that stuff. Does that kind of hit what you're asking?
Yeah, absolutely. When you're referring to thinnings in these, you know, stagnant 80-year-old stands, are these commercial or mid-story?
So yeah, it depends. Silviculturists will write the prescription, but we're usually there has been in recent years a big push to get away from, you know, those even rows from the original planting. It kind of looks like a giant cornfield or whatever. So they're trying to mark them in a manner that once that it's been thinned once or twice, that it's not so you know, human impact looking, but more approaching a closer. But usually my understanding is red pine doesn't exist in you know, solitary stands like that. It's usually mixed with other species. But yeah, that's kind of the approach that we take with that. It's usually harvested for through a timber sale.
Okay. Callie, what do you see parallels in the systems you've worked or not parallels?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't agree with Brian more. It's not going to just be fire. We know we're going to have to couple it with something. So just real quick, sort of, because I've been out there this week, our study involved unmanaged, I like the word abandoned also, unmanaged pine systems. You know, as soon as you quit managing them, which means either using an herbicide or a mulcher or something to keep the hardwoods out, they come in. So they are quickly colonized by hardwoods, you know, so might or might not be the ones you want, but you can get them. There's no planting them. They do come back. So how do you take these stands and sort of move them? They're still dominated in terms of basal area and stem density by the pines. Move them more towards favor these hardwoods. Well, obviously get a thin. We're fortunate that we have pulp market here for some of those pines, some of them more saw timber size. And so we did two thinnings. We sort of picked at it, did a light thinning, and we did a heavy thinning. So the light thinning was down to 75 residual BA, the heavy was 50. We have a problem with pine beetle down here in the south. And this is anecdotal, we're gonna look at it, but the stands that either were not thinned or were thinned lightly are still getting hammered by the pine beetle. So one of my take homes is going to be, how many chances are you going to have to thin a pine plantation? And I'm mostly speaking, and I apologize, more towards the National Forest folks. We have so many acres that need to be tended to. Get in there. If you're going to get in there and hit it hard. I would have hit it harder than leaving 50 BA. I would have left it down to 30 BA and then introduced this burning regime. So my quick take home is that without that thinning, you're going to be long term. So we just really quickly looked at like counts of mortality, and this is for all of our treatments. And we're in we're on burns number 6. So these stands have all had 5 burns repeated on a 3-year interval. And this is everybody together. So including background mortality, about 200 counts of, we have 12,000 stems that we're following. So 200 are dying a year every 3 years. And after the 5th fire, we had 500, more than doubled. And we think that's because in those stands that we didn't thin, the pine beetles got in. Doesn't have anything to do with fire, but without that thinning, we really are sort of creating a mess. And this was a study, and it was based on the forest plan. And the forest plan is public approved, and the public said you can go anywhere between 75 and 50. So we took the 2 extremes. But you know, lessons learned. We should have hit it harder. We're not going to be able to get back in there, and at this point, we're not even going to be able to salvage what's been killed. Long answer. Sorry.
No, I'm really appreciative, and I wish we had more time because I want to pursue that far. For instance, there's nobody on this call, I think, that is immune to southern pine beetle. 10 years ago, I think we would have thought differently, but I've heard reports recently and through other work we do, you know, this push that it is making into the northeastern US, and that it has showed up in alarmingly northern situations, and the connection that research has shown between what you just described, these heavily stocked unmanaged stands, and the risk to southern pine beetle is undeniable. And so thanks for that. I hope we all kind of can take what you just said to heart, because even if we don't think it's in our area, it certainly could be in the near future. There's so much more I wanted to talk about. Ben, I was going to ask you some cool questions about the losses in terms of value losses in timber stands due to changes in structure and composition, and some of your cool research that you did there. I know that paper was put into the chat box where you looked at changes, what I just said, changes to value, not from damage, but rather to differences in structure and composition. So I encourage everybody to check that out and to tune in again, because clearly we didn't finish this conversation. And I believe that we will pick it up again. I also really hope that we get to pick it up again in person at some point. And I think we're getting closer and closer to that. So with that, I'm going to close my portion and say thanks to everybody, and thanks for letting me participate in this. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrea.
Thanks, Joe. My gosh, what an amazing panel discussion this was. I just love being a part of Fueling Collaboration. I love listening in on all of these discussions. So just wanted to quickly say thank you so much, Joe, for moderating this excellent discussion. Ben, Callie, Brian, John, Heather, thank you so much to our panelists for all of your amazing insights. And for everyone who participated today in this discussion, we really appreciate you spending the past hour and a half with us. And we encourage you to come back if you like what you heard and you want to participate in our next Fueling Collaboration discussion. We will be featuring the topic of smoke management. Jack McGowan-Stinsky will be moderating, and he will be sharing with us why smoke is more than just smoke. And that discussion will be going on Thursday, January 20th. A quick reminder that recordings of this discussion and all of our Fueling Collaboration discussions are available both on the Northern Research Station website as well as on the Fueling Collaboration, so fuelingcollab.com